and people's ambitions and so forth, I thought this would be a great week to talk about the Tower of Babel. Right? Because one of the big questions, why did God not want them to build a tower? Right? But we'll take a look and see. So it says, "Come, let us build us a city, and a tower with its top in the sky," first skyscraper, "to make a name for ourselves, else we shall be scattered all over the world." Now, are there things that are, particularly interesting just looking at the verse?
What do they care if they get scattered?
You got to speak up a little bit, Ann.
Why do they not want to get scattered?
Yeah, why do they not want to be scattered? So we're going to deal with that question among others. Right? Anything else?
Well, I mean, that's real easy. If we didn't have telephones and high-speed communications, how would any of us feel with our families spread out over the country?
Yeah.
Or the world?
Yeah. It's only now that we have such things that it's much more bearable. I mean, we have 4 kids and only one of them is here in Houston. And really not crazy about the fact that our grandchildren are not here in Houston. Not as if we have any choice about it. But,
no,
but in the past, the generations all stayed very close together.
Oh yeah, I think it was really not until at least after the Industrial Revolution and probably significantly later that the majority of people in the world never traveled more than a day's journey from where they lived.
Probably right.
Yeah, well, I can't tell you where I learned that, but
I've heard that too.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, and what else is notable about this verse?
A name.
Making a name for ourselves. It's like, building a tower, you get to put your name on it. That probably doesn't resonate for anybody here. But.
Well, they wanted to be known. And if you build a city in those days, you were known because the land was barren. And a city represented a population center with a lot of control. Could be that it had housing that was more substantial. It had an order, and it was very public.
Just before this, everybody was living in Nimrod City.
Yeah, Nimrod City. Huh.
By building a city, they're putting down roots. They're staying here. This is our place, as opposed to just being a bunch of nomads.
Right. Well, like being scattered all over. And we like not being scattered all over. We like having all of our family together, certain stability. The people we live with are insiders. Everybody else is outsiders, but that's okay most of the time.
Well, even as our people were wandering around in the wilderness for 30 odd, almost 40 years, we were still together.
Yeah.
What these people are doing is they built a city. Not only are we together, but we are together in this place.
Mm-hmm. But what we find out in the text, and I don't have it right here in front of you, but what we find out in the text is that God doesn't seem to like this.
I think God's issue with it is they're building the tower to the heavens.
I'm sorry?
I think God's issue is they're building the tower to the heavens.
There was an echo in here.
It's from Anne's phone. Anne, I'm about to send you a tip on how to leave the computer audio so that you can only do audio from your cell phone, and that'll take away the echo.
Thank you, Ashley. Ashley is so great at solving problems.
Yes. She's very appreciative.
I just raise problems. I make problems. I don't solve problems. I mean, that's what Ashley's for.
Ashley is very appreciated.
It is. So, what is it that God doesn't like about this city?
They're building the tower to the heavens.
Yeah, it's like
they're reaching up as if they're going to God's house. Or
what's wrong with going to God's house? I thought we were just there, Dale.
Yeah, but that's God's house on earth. The idea of a God in the heavens, it's mysterious. It's his kingdom, and he didn't want the humans to invade and to begun to deify God and make it a tangible kind of thing. Because if you think about the ancient religions with the idols, they were tangible. They put them in edifices, if you wish, and that was very tangible and tactile. And God is considered to be ethereal and spiritual and all over the place, rather than just simply in an isolation.
Mm-hmm. So maybe the problem is the idolatry part, that
Right.
There's something ungodly about this tower. So anyway, we'll see a little bit of what the tradition has to say about this and how we cope with the different problems in this. And there are several. Right? So I'm going to go back to share screen and hope we don't get any more echo. So here is Rashbam. Rashbam is the grandson of Rashi. So he says, according to the straightforward sense of the text, what was the sin of the generation of the dispersion? Right? If it was just, building the tower with its top in the sky. So, in ancient times, we read about cities with walls sky high. Right? Rather, it is that the Holy One commanded them to be fertile and increase and fill the earth. But they chose instead to settle in a single place so that they wouldn't fill the earth. They wouldn't be scattered over the world. That is precisely why he decreed that they be scattered. So it's very interesting. We're reverting back to the text of Breshit to learn something about the generations after the beginning. And what God said to the first human beings, be fertile and increase and fill the earth, in Rashbam's opinion, that still applies. And all these generations later, and this is, after the flood, so this is a whole new group, right? But they have this tendency to want to settle in one place and just build the tower, something big. So that's Rashbam's opinion. Right? Next, similar. This is from Professor Nachum Sarna. Says this is a direct challenge to God because God had told the family of Noah pretty much what he had told the first human beings: abound in the earth and increase on it. So building the tower is a way of saying, no, we're not going to do that. Well, what happens when God wants you to do something and you don't want to do it?
You get punished in some way.
Yeah, well, that seems to be the pattern in Breshit, right? So that you see in Sarna's commentary. Other comments or questions here? Okay, so next, from Chizkuni's commentary, he focuses on the part that says to make a name for ourselves. And what does that mean? He says, we need a reputation for power. If we build that tower, we'll be known as for our power. Otherwise, we shall be scattered, because if we don't build a city and a tower, we can be more easily defeated in war. Okay? Now, that sounds logical. It may not override God's instructions, but it doesn't sound idolatrous. It doesn't sound evil. It has a very practical ring to it, right?
In this time frame, why do we have to prepare for war?
I would guess that as long as human beings have existed, there have been excuses for war.
And let's go back to what Moses said when he charged these original 12 spies. It was, if you find them in walled cities, we don't have to fear them.
Uh-huh. Right. All right. So next commentary, kind of a qualified commentary following Chizkuni. He says, yeah, it's not as if all humanity would be able to live in one city, right? But they believe that if they built a big tower in their city, all the other cities would be established near theirs, and they would be the primary city with that big tower. Everybody else would be secondary. Everybody else would be subsidiary. And from the tower, they would be able to see over them all and prevent all those other cities from considering themselves independent. Does that have a logical ring to it?
Yeah, it's the concept of a major city and its satellites.
Yes.
And somebody has to, and wants the power and wants to control them. And everybody has to go to that city for everything else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I hope they're not spying on you guys from downtown Houston.
That'd be a little distant.
Well, yeah, but you know, we have more powerful magnification than they did back in the time of this tower.
I don't think the people in the city of Houston have the time to be bothered with the people in Brazoria County.
Probably not, and probably not focused on taking over the suburbs either.
They can't.
Well, right. Yeah.
Well, Houston is not that far from us, but there's a city of Pearland between them and us, and we are actually incorporated as is Pearland, and they can't touch us.
Right. Okay. Other comments or questions up to here? let me ask, is anyone here, has anyone here become familiar with Aviva Zornberg? Very interesting person. She lives in Israel. All of her books have been in English. She grew up in England. Her father apparently was a Rosh Yeshiva in Manchester, which has a fairly substantial Jewish community and certainly a very notable yeshiva. And it's one of those things, I don't think he had sons. So his daughters, got to listen in on all the lessons or whatever else was going on in their whereabouts. And she got I believe, a PhD in English literature. And some of the things she does with Torah text are just fascinating. You have to have a taste for it because she can be very dense reading. But she has some wonderful insights. So thought I'd share this piece. She says the generation of the flood, meaning the generation before Noah, is like the generation of the tower. The former's approach to life is to indulge the self, either me or you. The latter seem to do better in dealing with each other, but their motto is me and not you. It's you as in God. They cannot accept God's authority. What neither generation can encompass is a world with God at its center. So in other words, the tower is a way of saying, our center is earth-focused and not God-focused. Any thoughts about this? Any reactions? All right. So one more interesting commentary here. And this is not about why they did what they did, but why God wants them to fill the earth. Right? So Gersonides, so actually there are two commentaries dealing with this issue. Gersonides says the Holy One knew they had to be scattered, for every location on earth has some particular deficit that can cause harm: earthquakes, hail, and the like. Tornadoes, hurricanes, whatever. Right? If they remained in one place, they might all be killed in some natural way. But if they were scattered throughout the earth, there would always be others to perpetuate the species. And I find it interesting that this is right after God has made a promise and said, I will never do that again. I brought the flood, basically wiped out almost everybody, but I will never do that again. And so it's important that people not, simply stay in one place, because one place is always going to be vulnerable. Like Houston, right? And the second piece here, which comes from Rabbi Isaiah Horowitz, he says, it wasn't that they didn't believe in God. The generation of the tower still meant to serve and respect God. Their sin was in wanting to isolate God's name to the heavens. They wanted a clear separation of earthly and heavenly authority. The earth would thus be under human sovereignty only. In other words, it's not that they didn't believe in God. It's that they have a misunderstanding about God. Their idea of God is, we'll take care of things down here. You go take care of things up there. That'll be your job. God says, no, no, no. No, no, no. I am everywhere.
How about the rabbis that have argued with God?
Well, arguing with God, that pretty well goes back to Abraham. And I could argue, should have gone back to Noah.
Well,
That's what I mentioned tonight at Shul, Del.
Well, no, what I mean is argued with God as in you told the story of the yeshiva, or is the law this way or that way?
Yes.
And one man basically justified it as his idea was what it says in the Torah, and the other people basically said, well, God's turned the place over to us, and so it's up to us to do it our way.
Right. So that is the famous story from the Talmud, from Baba Metzia, where, the issue is almost trivial. Of course, in the Talmud, when the rabbis get to arguing, nothing is trivial. But to us moderns, it's about the kashrut of a particular oven, okay, and how you can restore it to kashrut. Okay? So one rabbi says one thing, and all the other rabbis are on the other side. And the rabbi says, if I'm right, let the carob tree that's outside the study house pull itself up out, roots and all, and trot down the road and plant itself back in. And they all look out the window, and sure enough, there goes the carob tree toddling down the road. Everybody says, but the leader of the opposition, Rabbi Joshua, says, we can't learn anything from a carob tree uprooting itself. This is our job. It's our job to figure out what's right here, what the law should be. And Rabbi Eliezer says, if I'm right, let the stream outside the study house turn around and run upstream. Everybody looks out, and sure enough, stream turns around, runs upstream, and Rabbi Joshua says, well, very impressive, but we can't really learn anything from a river running upstream. No? God, give us an argument. Give us some logic. Give us, we'll listen to you. We got all day, right? In fact, they had all time, right? So he says, if I'm right, let a voice come forth from heaven and prove that I'm right. Boop. Voice comes out, a bat kol, a heavenly voice, says, why are you tormenting my son, Rabbi Eliezer? The law is exactly as he says. To which Rabbi Joshua says, we don't pay any attention to heavenly voices anymore. We have psychiatrists for that. That's not what he said, but you get the idea. Yeah. He said, God, you gave us the law, and you gave it for us to figure out how to employ it and how to apply it. There are two postscripts to this story. One of them, there's a happy one and a sad one. The happy one is that after this discussion takes place, the next day, one of the rabbis is wandering around in the marketplace where he runs into Elijah the prophet. Don't ask how he knew it was Elijah. Some people are just smarter than I am, right? And so he went up and he asked, are you Elijah the prophet? Yes, he was just making sure. And Elijah said, yes, that I am. And so he asked him, were you there with God when we were having that discussion yesterday? And Elijah says, I was. And the rabbi asks him, what did God say? Elijah says, God laughed and said, my children have won against me. My children have won. In other words, children grow up and they become independent. And at a certain point, we have to take responsibility for applying God's law. And God approves that process. That's appendix number 1. Appendix number 2 to the story is that Rabbi Eliezer never accepted the decision of the other rabbis. And he continued to insist that the law was as he said it was and not as the majority of the sages said it was. And ultimately, because of this, he was excommunicated from the rabbinic fellowship.
And his wife tried to keep him from praying against the other rabbis.
That's another story, but we won't go there tonight. Yes, but there's great bitterness over that, right? And we can understand that. Sometimes you draw a line in the sand, and I'm sure at a certain point, Rabbi Eliezer had to know that there was going to be an unhappy response, and that's what happened. Right? All right. So sometimes we think that, God is up there. In reality, we're the ones who have to bring God down here. We're the ones who have to apply the law and bring God into everyday existence. End of that story. Other comments or questions here?
The Kotzker rabbi, was it, who said, where is Hashem? He's where you let him in?
Yes, that's correct. Somebody's been listening to me in Shul. Actually, Ann probably knew that a long time before I said it in Shul. But yeah, Kotzker Rebbe asked his students, where is God? And they came up with all sorts of answers, and he said that you're all wrong, which was one of his favorite lines, by the way. You're all wrong. Kotzker was just kind of like that. But he said, wherever you let him in. All right. Next. Okay. So here's God's response. The Lord came down to look at the city and tower that man had built. Uses the phrase B'nai Ha'adam, literally the children of man. Right? Okay. So, what is this about? Right? Does God have to come down and see? The Midrash asks, is not all open and revealed to him? Rather, it is to teach us, not to judge a case or to speak of what we have not personally seen. In other words, God comes down to take a close look by way of teaching us, don't judge something unless we've really gotten involved with it. Okay? Similarly, says Rashi, judges should not convict a defendant until they see and understand the evidence. Right? And finally, the teaching from Pirkei Avot, from Hillel, do not judge your fellow man until you stand in his situation. In other words, all of these have in common the idea that you don't pass judgment until after getting well acquainted with the situation. Okay. Now it's noteworthy that that Rashi has yet another comment on this verse. He says the last clause of the verse is superfluous. The city and tower that man had built, right? Why do we need to have the phrase that man had built? You know, who then? Who else, right? So he says, rather the phrase B'nai Ha'adam, right? Literally the sons of Adam, is an allusion to the ingratitude of Adam. It's there to remind you about something that Adam did. And what was that? Just as he
blamed on Eve.
Yeah. So these people rebel against the one who provided them life and rescued their ancestors from the flood. Okay. Now, not every commentator buys this. Okay. So, for instance, Yosef Bechor Shor says this text is just talking the way that people talk. Right? Obviously, God can, he doesn't have to go down and see, and there's nothing special about that phrase. Right? And maybe also there's nothing special about the phrase B'nai Ha'adam. Okay? Sforno comments on this. He says, the Lord came down to look, just as it says when you look at the text later on about Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay? But he came down to look only at a stage just before things have gotten so bad that punishment is required. Okay? That's when God gets involved. I don't find that particularly satisfying because there are lots of times when you'd rather God not wait until it gets that bad. But that's Sforno. Right? Okay. Next, the following verse. And the Lord said, if as one people with one language for all, this is how they have begun to act, then nothing that they may propose to do will be out of their reach. So, first of all, this seems to give God's rationale. Right? That if they're going to build a tower, then they can do anything, and maybe they shouldn't be able to do anything. When I look at this verse, I think of one of the big differences between Judaism and Christianity, and that is Christianity often historically took a stand against certain kinds of progress, right? So, for instance, think about cloning, right? Most Christian authorities are totally opposed to the idea of cloning, right? It's like you're playing God and you can't do that. Jewish authorities, while they certainly approach the issue cautiously, their attitude is more like, you're playing God. Well, that's interesting. Wonder how that's going to work out. If you can find a way to do cloning in a way that is safe, then let's talk about the kinds of circumstances where we would be willing to employ it.
But what if only some people can afford it?
Okay, so that doesn't necessarily rule out being able to do it for those who can afford it.
Wouldn't be fair. Some people can make lots of selves, and the other people only get one self.
Well, the commandment is be fruitful and multiply. This is a way of multiplying for people that can't otherwise do it. And also,
and that tends to be the rule where authorities would be willing to consider cloning, and that is when you can't do it in any other natural way, and even some of the less natural ways that have been developed, right? Then, you know, let me give you a hypothetical case, okay? A couple comes to me, they're about 40, they've been married for 8 years, 10 years, let's say. They've tried every which way to have a child. And now they want to explore cloning. And we're at a time where cloning can be done safely, okay? It's expensive, but they can do it. And just to ramp this up a little bit, let's say that both of these people come from families of Holocaust survivors. And let's say that they are the only children of these Holocaust survivors. And now they're coming to me as the rabbi. What do you think I'm going to tell
them? Go for it.
You know, I would have to have a really, really good reason not to tell them to go for it. Assuming they've tried all the other more logical things, assuming that it's safe, why wouldn't I tell them to go for it? But Rabbi, you're playing God.
No, that's not the problem. Not everybody's going to come to the rabbi. So all the rich people will make lots and lots of themselves, and nobody else is going to be able to afford it. They're going to.
Well, we're not talking about making lots and lots of ours. We're not talking about making an army of clones. We're talking about people who want to have a child.
But you can't say that's not the only thing that will happen. If there's wealthy people, they're going to make money if they want. They're not going to ask you.
We would have to have some sort of legislation about cloning to be sure.
Well, right. And what's the problem with wealthy people being able to spend their money to do things they want to do that follow the commandments?
What was that last phrase?
I say, what's the problem with wealthy people being able to spend their money the way they want to do it and follow one commandment?
And follow one commandment.
Have 2 words. Yeah. I heard the first part.
Yeah, to follow the commandment, right? You know, be fruitful and multiply.
And I mean, for years we've had in vitro fertilization. That's not cheap either.
No, it's not. Seen families that went through that.
And another example of cloning would be you've got 2 people, they've had a child, and something happens, the child's in an accident.
Yes.
Well, the child is dying, you know he's dying, you can't undo that. So you clone the child.
And of course, there's another thing. Let's say that you have a child who has a disease and needs someone who matches him for some kind of transplant. Right?
Oh, so the second child is just going to be a farm from which to take things from the other one? No identity of his own? No right to...
No, I would hope not. But, you know, you can, however, take a piece of that child's liver and do the liver transplant so that the other child can also live.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I have heard of cases where a family has a child with a disease, and they absolutely go and get pregnant, have another child with the explicit idea that this new child will be close enough genetic match to the sick child to harvest certain parts.
Yes. But the only way to be sure of that
is a clone.
Is a clone. So I understand the problems, and my teacher, Dr. Yeshurun, Oliver Sholem, wrote about this extensively. I can share with you some of what he wrote about it if you're interested. But
yes, that would be.
Let's kind of step back towards the text here. Here's God, and God doesn't want them to play God. Even though we Jews sometimes, we like creativity, right? We think creativity is divine, and we like it. And we like to emulate God in that way. So Abarbanel comments on this. What was so bad about having a common language? Isn't this something for which people should strive? Before the tower was built, everything was peaceful. Afterwards, speaking the same language, they argued over who would do which chore, who would get the credit for what part of the work. They became preoccupied with their individual stature and stopped thinking of the community. So this is a very interesting approach here. It's not that there was anything wrong with having a common language. It's what purpose you use it for.
Well, having multiple languages does lead to misunderstandings between people, whereas with a common language, there can be communication.
Yeah. So here, God changing their language is just a tactic to get them distracted from the task. But it's the task that's the problem, not the common language. And so here is Sforno commenting on this also. It says, speaking only one language, not a problem. But one language alludes to the deeper goal of the builders, one religion, one way. And it was because God saw that they were suppressing differences in thought and action that he decided to stop them. If they were all working under a unified direction, nothing would prevent them from completing whatever they intended to do, all people acting upon their united decision, and not one of them would turn aside to know God or to understand that he was the creator of all.
So does that mean that according to Sforno, it's not okay to make everybody be Jewish?
Well, Sforno and practically everybody else in every other rabbinic authority. Right? There's almost no circumstances where you can find a rabbi saying, oh, under certain circumstances, you can compel other people to be Jewish. It's almost unheard of.
Brother, Judaism does not actually encourage conversion. They make it very difficult because they don't want, it's not a proselytizing religion.
Yes, however, there were eras where conversion was much more fluid than it is today. Now, the laws of conversion were really only developed in the time of the Talmud. Until then, if somebody wanted to become Jewish, well, you probably did it the way Ruth did, right? You married in or you moved in and you became part of the community. You know, you might be an outsider for a while, but you could earn your way in. And there was no conversion ritual in the time of the Bible, certainly not in the time of Ruth. Okay. So, you know, yeah, we make it today a little bit more of a challenge to join the Jewish community, but it wasn't always like that.
Well, it stopped when Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, and anybody who got converted was condemned to death,
right.
as was whoever converted him.
And then, of course, in many other places, it became very dangerous for people to pursue conversion, or for the Jewish community that would have liked to embrace them. Okay, so let's look at this last piece, the piece from the Chafetz Chaim. Right? He says, this should be a great incentive for us to take this drive, meaning the drive of building this tower or having this common language, utilizing it in a positive fashion for any quality used for good is more powerful than if it is used for evil. Who could imagine what we could do in God's service if we could indeed serve him with one language, meaning with one mind and heart? In other words, if we as a united Jewish community would actually serve God in that way, that would be an incredibly powerful force. As it is, over the period of my rabbinate, over the past 40 years, it's amazed me how many people are interested in converting to Judaism, even if they didn't have someone Jewish that they were interested in marrying. Had so many people who either pursued conversion or actually wound up converting to Judaism just because they were drawn to it, and in some cases they were drawn to it from childhood. So, also one mind and one heart. We have all that service together. Comments or questions on any of this? I think that at least, from the first part of what we've covered tonight, there's a lot that suggests that perhaps it is God's plan that the whole earth be inhabited, which might affect the way that we think about nationalism. Right? Yes, Barbara.
Could it be that God's plan was to A, inhabit all of the earth, and B, to make many kinds of people? And so he used the idea of creating multiple languages to scatter the people and to create all the different cultures. And this is the way that the earth was populated with many people and many ideas.
Yes. Actually, I don't remember where, but Rav Kook, in the early 20th century, suggests something very close to that.
There's another reason to think that, because there's a midrash that says that Adam was not made of just any old dirt, but dirt from all over the world of every color.
Interesting. Yeah.
Which suggests that he wanted all kinds of people to inhabit the earth.
And all kinds of places, all kinds of civilizations. Okay. All right. I will leave it at that for tonight. Thank you all very much. And Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.
Okay.
Looking good, Barbara. Mazel tov again. Yashar Koach to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.